Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of What's Up with Power. My name is Justin Wagner with TeamODZ, and that person making racket in the back right now is Tex Divine. We'll get him to sort out that microphone, but I'm like shaming your friends when they're interrupting the live stream. Anyway, we are happy to have another episode. We got a live ride going on in Zwift right over here. We're going to be rolling out in about 45 seconds. We've got a host, a guest today, Taylor Thomas from Thomas Endurance Coaching, and he's going to be talking about strengths and weaknesses. How do we determine those objectively? And the conversation we're going to spur today is, hey, can we make our weaknesses become our strengths? So I think on that topic, we're going to discuss that quite a bit. First, we're going to have 15-minute teaching from Taylor, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A. So with that, I'm going to bring Taylor on the screen. Taylor, how's it going?
Hey, Justin, how are you?
I'm doing great. So we are rolling out now. I'm going to hand you the slides, hop off the screen, and let you go to town.
Cool. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us. Like Justin said, today we're going to talk about determining your strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately, what do we do with that information? Once we have it. So, is there anything we can do from a training perspective to make those weaknesses more in line or closer to our strengths? So, we'll dive right in. There's a fair amount of density to cover. So, Justin, if you're not on the first slide, you can slide that over for me. So the first place we want to start, well, I guess the caveat is obviously that this is all power based, and so we're going to be looking at how to best utilize the power data that we have from training and from racing. So first place we want to start is with what's called the power profile. So the great thing about the power profile is that it is kind of the first step in helping to gain insight into our relative strengths and weaknesses, as well as our physiological systems or the physiological systems that are at work that make up whatever strengths and weaknesses we have as riders. So it's kind of, again, the first step and kind of a snapshot of what's generally the strengths and weaknesses and what's going on behind the scenes from the perspective of the systems in your body. Now, the reason we want to look at it this way and not any other way. So oftentimes cyclists and racers fall into the trap of looking at their performance in relation to whatever category, whatever race category they're in, and whatever their competition is doing. Now, as we know, with power-based data, that all of our training, all the information that we receive from our power meter is hyper individualized, and so that's the way that we want to look at determining our strengths and weaknesses. So instead of saying this is what's common for a Cat 3 road racer, we want to say what's the best performance for me as a rider, and not compare that to another rider or standards within a particular category. So the idea is to be as individualized as possible, and like I said before, kind of drill down and focus on those physiological systems that are at work to produce the efforts that we need to train and race. So again, understanding yourself is the key. We want to make sure to use that power profile to critique and understand ourselves. That's really the most impactful way to utilize our available power data and the metrics that come along with that. Not comparison with other riders, or again, comparison within racing categories. So the four primary durations that the power profile is going to look at, you can see from the screenshot on the slide here. It's going to be 5 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes, and functional threshold power, FTP, or lactate threshold. So the reason that those durations exist is because they most closely correspond to key systems in the body. So your 5-second power is going to correspond to neuromuscular power. Your 1 minute is going to be anaerobic, your 5-minute VO2 max, and of course your FTP is going to be your lactate threshold. Now, it's important to remember that when you look at these durations, that you're not, those durations don't isolate those specific systems in the body, meaning that a 5-second power is not all neuromuscular. There's aerobic strength involved, there's anaerobic capacity involved. The same thing with an FTP level effort or an FTP duration effort. It's not all aerobic, right? There's some neuromuscular, there's some anaerobic, there's some VO2 max. So the body's very complex, and there's a lot of systems that work at any given time, but these durations do the best job of isolating and providing some insight into those particular systems. All right, next slide, Justin. So now that we know that the power profile is the best way, or the first step to look at identifying strengths and weaknesses, we need to figure out a way to test for that. So the testing protocol for calculating or constructing the power profile, it's relatively lengthy in that there's several steps. For the purposes of this presentation, I won't go into great detail about the actual test. You can find it in Training and Racing with a Power Meter. It's online. It's a fairly standardized process, but there is several steps. Ultimately, all you're doing in that test is producing efforts to produce or to feed the power profile. So you're producing peak powers for that 5-second, 1 minute, 5 minute, and FTP, which you should really already have if you're training with power. So you've really already knocked out the lactate threshold effort. So we'll dive into kind of the specifics of what we're looking for. Strength to weight ratio, watts per kilogram, is really a critical metric for training with power in general. But as we start to look at the power profile and ultimately get into more detail about strengths and weaknesses, knowing what that watts per kilogram number means for you individually and what it means for you in terms of what duration you're strongest at is going to be really, really important. So if you're on Zwift, you're very familiar with that. They're using watts per kilogram as kind of the core metric to distinguish group rides and different efforts. So it's become something that's top of mind for most riders training with power, but just know that you should understand that and understand what it means for your strengths and weaknesses. So after you've performed the test and you've produced the efforts necessary to give you the numbers that you want for all of the key durations, we want to look at the peak powers. So understanding what those peak powers mean for each duration. So if you're producing really strong efforts in the 5-second category, and maybe your 5-minute or your lactate threshold efforts are lacking a little bit from a watts per kilogram perspective, then you start to understand that potentially your strengths lie in the neuromuscular and not so much in the VO2 max or the lactate threshold. Obviously, on the other end of the spectrum, you could have low sprint power, and you could have very high sustained power relative to your weaknesses and relative to your body weight. So you want to start to position those numbers in a way that they make sense to you and they make sense to the type of rider that you want to be, what your goals are, what your training goals are, what your racing goals are. So looking at those peak powers, starting to kind of paint the picture for yourself. Ultimately, those peak powers and that relationship that you see in that power profile will start to give you what's called a rider phenotype. So if anybody's using WKO4 software, you're familiar with the rider phenotype. But what this does is it is a way to kind of classify riders based on these strengths and weaknesses, or ultimately these kind of watts per kilogram for each duration. So you could be what's called an all-arounder. You could be a sprinter, a time trialist, a pursuiter. These are just names to provide some sort of classification to what it is you're best at. All-arounder, you're going to be pretty good at all of the powers. Again, 5-second, 1 minute, 5 minute, and lactate threshold. Time trialist, you're going to be good at sustained efforts. Pursuiter has their own classifications or their own strengths. Sprinter, obviously good at the lower end of the spectrum. So that's just a good way to kind of assign some sort of nomenclature to the rider to generally understand what they're best at. And then lastly, it's worth mentioning in the power profile that age isn't taken into consideration. So there is a normal degradation of performance for men and women. Typically after 30, things start to decline at some rate. Men a little faster than women, but it's there. It's something we all know exists. What's important to note is that it's probably not going to affect your gross strengths and weaknesses. So if you're a really good sprinter, you might be not producing the powers that you would have produced when you were 20 years old, but you're still going to have the propensity to be strong in that shorter durations. And then obviously on the other end of the spectrum, if you're a good time trialist or your lactate threshold is strong, then you're gonna remain strong in those areas. Just the gross power is not going to be the same as it would have been when you were younger. So doesn't change the strengths and weaknesses. Probably worth considering as you think about race strategies, as you think about race selection. Take age into consideration and what that means in comparison to the field that you're up against and to the terrain. Next slide, Justin. All right, so we're going to take the power profile and we're going to take it a step further. So the power profile, like I said, really great at identifying gross strengths and weaknesses. So what duration generally, what physiological system in the body generally am I best suited for? And what does that mean for me as a rider? The fatigue profile takes things a step further, pinpoints exactly within those durations what types of efforts you're best suited for. So we'll dive into what that actually means and what I mean when I say that. So when in the power profile, if we're looking at 5 second, 1 minute, 5 minute, and 20 minute or FTP level efforts, and that's all we're looking at, the fatigue profile actually breaks those durations down. And you're able to see within those ranges or within a range within those systems in the body, what specific duration are you best suited for? So maybe your 5 minute effort isn't fantastic, but if you look at the fatigue profile, you might see that your 3 minute effort or your 8 minute effort is really strong. Conversely, maybe your 5 second power isn't great, but maybe you see that for 10 seconds or 20 seconds, you're able to sustain a high level of power. So that's what the fatigue profile does. It breaks down those durations. You're able to see with a great deal of accuracy where it is exactly that you're strongest. So this is a phenomenal tool for race strategies, right? If you're thinking about when to break on a sprint, what a breakaway should look like, when to attack on a hill climb, knowing that you can produce your peak effort for say 3 minutes is gonna greatly inform your race strategy and ultimately inform your training strategy because you're going to train to bolster those strengths. So fatigue profile, once you dive in, really, really valuable. So of course, we have to feed the fatigue profile the numbers that it needs. So we're going to need some more testing. If you've been training with power for a long time, several seasons, and you have a lot of historical data, specifically historical race data, then it's okay to cherry pick your peak numbers for the fatigue profile. If you don't have that, then you can perform testing just like you'll do for the power profile. Same thing with the power profile, or as the power profile. The testing protocol for producing the fatigue profile, kind of lengthy. I won't go into great detail about what that specifically looks like, but you can find that in Training and Racing with a power meter and online, just like the power profile. But ultimately, it's a series of 4 tests. It's gonna be 2 days of testing. If you need to produce those numbers, you'll take 1 day and you'll produce the efforts necessary for the neuromuscular and the anaerobic capacity. You'll usually rest for 1 or 2 days. The next day of testing, you'll do the VO2 and the lactate threshold testing. Again, you probably already have the FTP test, so you might just have to do the VO2 max effort. Again, the idea is that you're producing your peak maximum best powers to feed this model to then have a greater understanding of your strengths and weaknesses. So once you produce those numbers, basically you're just plotting those numbers and looking for relationships within those durations. So if again, say for the neuromuscular, if you're strong throughout from 5 seconds, 10 seconds to 20 seconds, and you're able to hold or with a very slight percentage degradation between 10 seconds and 20 seconds, that's going to tell you that you have a very strong fatigue resistance or very high fatigue resistance for the neuromuscular capacity. Same thing with lactate threshold. If you are able to extend your typical FTP 20-minute effort out to, say, 30 minutes or even 60 minutes, then that's going to give you a lot of insight into that lactate threshold aerobic capacity that's going on in the body. So looking for when it is that your power drops off or how it is that your power continues to sustain itself throughout those ranges is really what the fatigue profile is all about. And you can start to see very clearly where it is you fatigue. You can, in training, you can extend that duration by prescribing intervals that push those boundaries. So whether that's, you're really good at 3-minute intervals or you really have a really strong 3-minute power and the 5-minute power is lacking, of course, you can extend and build towards producing a strong 5-minute effort. So fatigue profile, extremely, extremely valuable, specifically for race day strategies and understanding exactly where it is you're strongest and using that on the back end to inform your training prescription. Next slide, Justin. So when we get our numbers, we look at the fatigue resistance. There's categories of fatigue resistance. And these are, again, just tools to help you understand, much like the rider phenotype. These are just assignments that are going to help you understand the types of efforts you produced, where it is you need to focus your training, and maybe how it is that you need to think through race strategy, and understanding if it's worth spending time really focusing on your weaknesses, or maybe those weaknesses are just places that that might not be able to improve as much as you'd like, and you can just focus more on your strengths. So if you're what's called below average or even well below average, that doesn't mean that you're not good at those durations. What it really means is that you're really just better at the shorter end of that spectrum. So again, with the fatigue profile, we're looking at a range within those durations. So for VO2 max, that might mean that you're just better at the 3-minute effort than you are at the 8-minute effort. So there's room for growth in terms of fatigue. So you can push your fatigue resistance further out and deeper into that duration, and that's going to mean that you, if you can last longer, obviously that means your fatigue resistance is higher. So the great thing about below average or well below average is that there's tremendous potential for growth in terms of developing those weaknesses, and that can be done through training. If you're average, you'd expect to see very consistent degradation across those durations, right? So through that spectrum, regardless of the physiological system that we're focused on, you're not going to see any huge spikes. You're not going to see any big drops. You're just going to see a fairly consistent drop-off as the duration kind of goes on. And this is kind of your all-arounder rider, right? This is a rider who's pretty good at a little bit of everything. Fairly strong sprint, fairly strong FTP or watts per kilogram for their individual self. Again, this average rider, because they're at a baseline, they can really decide based on their racing goals what it is they want to improve, right? So if they want to be a crit racer, they can really ramp up and work the neuromuscular and see a lot of gains there. If they want to be a time trialist or an endurance racer, you can work on the lactate threshold, those 20, 60, 90-minute powers, and they can see a lot of gains there. So kind of a good jumping off point, so to speak, if you're getting those average numbers for any of the durations. If you're above average, or there's even well above average, then this means that you're showing extremely strong watts per kilogram at the top end of that spectrum for each duration. So that's great because that's a very clear strength, right? If you come back with above average or well above average readings, that's obviously a place that you're very strong. The downside to that is it probably means that you're so strong that's going to be where you're always strongest. You're not going to be able to bolster or strengthen those weaknesses that you see enough to override or come close to the strengths that you're showing. So if you're well above average for VO2 max, that's always going to be your strength, and neuromuscular is probably never going to come close to the level of performance that you've already shown for VO2 max, as an example. So kind of a blessing and a curse. Good that you're very strong at it, probably means that you should just focus on that and pick your races and ultimately your race strategy based on those natural strengths. So power versus fatigue. So we've gone into the fatigue profile. We've talked to a fair degree of detail about what that means and why it's good. The difference between the power profile and the fatigue profile is really important to understand. The distinction is really critical. The power profile looks across the 4 durations that we talked about. So across the neuromuscular, the anaerobic capacity, the VO2, and the lactate threshold. The fatigue profile compares durations within those time periods, and ultimately the idea or the intent and goal is that by comparing within those ranges, we're able to more closely and more accurately reflect the systems that are at work in the body. So the power profile is kind of your base level. That starts to give you some insight, like I said, into those gross strengths and weaknesses. The fatigue profile dives in and starts to really pinpoint exactly what's going on in the body. Where is it within each of those systems that your body begins to fatigue, and how is it that you can use that information to better inform your training and your racing strategy. So if you can combine the power profile and kind of the oversight and the insight that it allows, and then dig deeper into the fatigue resistance, you're able to really craft an extremely strong, again, strategy in terms of what you should do from a training perspective, and then you can carry that over into race day strategy as well. So that's all I have. I'll kick it back over to Justin. We'll go to questions and answers. I know there's a lot of information here, so let me know if there's anything I can clarify. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Taylor. Back here on the screen. So interesting. You, if I understand, you're saying there that your answer to can your weaknesses become your strengths, you would say within a given profile, so like let's say VO2, let's say if you're really strong at the 3-minute VO2 but weak at the 8-minute, you could probably train out to the 8-minute and improve that. But let's say looking larger at a macro level, if you are a really, really good sprinter comparatively to your, let's say or maybe let's go the other direction. Let's say you're a really good time trialist and you just really don't have any 15-second power. you would basically say, sure, you can improve your sprint, but you're not going to reach the point where your sprint is relatively better than your time trialing. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And within, like you said, within a certain range, I think the key to kind of this entire approach, like I said, is one is individualization. So looking specifically at what it is or what's going on specific to you as a rider, and secondly, and really I think for training in general, it's about maximizing your time. So it's not worth your time to force efforts that you may not be uh, well designed for, right? You might want to be a fantastic sprinter, and that's all you've ever dreamed about. It might just not be in the cards, right? And you might just want to be a great time trialist, and you might just want to play to your strengths. And like you said, yes, your sprint strength can get better, but it might not be. It might not ever get to the above average or the well above average, and so that should help an athlete decide where it is they spend their time, right? And what races and what types of racing they do. So yeah, I think that's great. That's what's great about the fatigue profile and looking at fatigue resistance is you can really boil all that down and say, okay, this is what's going on in my body, and this is how my body responds to these efforts, and ultimately where I should be spending my time to maximize my gains.
Very good. I think one further scenario I'd look at, I think might be a good illustration here, where your weakness might be holding you down in a race. You might not be able to improve that weakness to a point of being your strong suit, but working on it can help you better achieve results with your strong suit. So let me be specific about that, because that was a lot of general wording. So I'm a sprinter. I know I have a really strong 5-second power, but I'm never at the end. I'm never at the right point in the race where I can blow, I'm either too fatigued at that point, or I'm just not there to be able to deliver that sprint. And I'd say, in this case, it sounds like, and maybe you can correct me if I'm completely off base here, this person would probably need to work on their threshold. So basically, they don't get, if they can increase their threshold more, they'll be more rested and better positioned towards the end of the race to deliver that sprint, because they're just getting too worn out during the race, and then they can't deliver the sprint. They may not time trial off the front, but they'll be at the right point in the right place.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's the key is, the critical piece of that is using the information you have to inform race strategy, right? So yeah, maybe the sprint's not there, but maybe there's something that you can do to put yourself in a better position. You can use your strengths to position yourself better in the race. So maybe that's being in position earlier. Yeah, like you said, maybe you're not, TT off the front, but maybe, you can start a break early on, because you can time trial, at 105% of FTP for 10 minutes. And then, yeah, like you said, then if you've worked on your sprint a little bit, you've used your strengths to put you in position in that race to then produce an effort that could be race winning. So I think you also want to use it to kind of, or you definitely want to use it to alter or think more critically about your race strategy, and using those strengths to position yourself better in a race. Because, ultimately at the end of the day, if you're an athlete that is training to race day performance is the measure of success, right? It's not the category you're in. It's not the training. It's not your FTP. If you're training to be a racer, then it's how well you did in a race. And so all of this is being used to inform the decisions that you make about how to be better at racing.
Yeah, I think that's a great example where you know your strength, you know where you would break down, and you use your strengths to affect the race dynamics. So a person who knows they're not going to be the best sprinter has to break up the pack throughout the race and drop the people who would destroy him in the sprint so that he can contend in a smaller group at the end. Exactly. Where maybe,
yeah,
they're not
at that point, when you can break the field down like that, you're probably, to your point, if you can get to the end of the race with a smaller field, those athletes are the ones that probably have the same strengths and weaknesses that you do, right? If you've seen from the fatigue profile that you're really strong at 8 minutes and you can produce VO2 efforts at 8 minutes, then you might launch, you might break the field up at 8 minutes. And so the people left at the end are going to be the people that are performing in that above average or well above average category for that longer duration or extended fatigue within the VO2 max kind of realm. But they're also going to be the people that probably, like you, don't have fantastic sprint capabilities. So you're able to kind of weed out the field, and you're able to position yourself in a group of people that are like-minded or like ability. So yeah, and that's the way you want to think about race strategy. As you look at this fatigue profile, you can start to break it down and really think about, okay, when am I going to launch an attack? How do I break up the field? How do I disrupt the front? When we're 10 minutes out, when we're 8 minutes out, 5 minutes out, whatever it is. So yeah, a lot of power in the fatigue profile when you start to apply those durations to what that looks like for race day performance.
Very good. Well, we are out of time for today. Thank you so much, Taylor, for coming on. Your insights have been very helpful, very interesting. If you guys want to contact Taylor, his website is thomasendurancecoaching.com. He's on Twitter at endurance_coach. And you can email him directly at taylor@thomasendurancecoaching.com. For this previous episodes of What's Up with Power or any other episodes you may have missed, you want to catch up with on the road, we now have a podcast. We take all this content, package the audio, and make it available for you to listen to at your own leisure. So find your favorite podcasting app or platform and search for The Endurance Lab, and you'll find it. This episode should be up there later today for replay, or maybe to share with your friends who weren't able to watch live. The video is also available live here on Facebook, Mixer, Twitch, and YouTube for replay as well. So once again, thank you for coming. We hope to see you again next week. And with that, we will be signing off.